He arrived home like any other Friday night, complaining about the traffic and leaving his keys on the table. I took off his coat to hang it up, and that's when I noticed the red mark on his neck. Before I could even ask, he laughed and said, "Oh, that? It was lipstick on the glass at the bar. The light is deceiving." I remained silent, but that explanation didn't fit with what I was seeing. At the time, I didn't want to make a fuss. I prepared dinner, poured the wine, and tried to act normal. But while he talked about the weekend game, all I could think about was the image I'd seen. It was a very well-defined mark, hard to mistake for a blur of glass. I kept it inside and kept smiling, as if nothing had changed. Later, when I picked up my phone to check my messages, a notification popped up in my friend group. It was a photo of him taken earlier, at the same bar. And there was the same mark, only even clearer, right on his neck. My heart sank, and doubt turned into certainty that something wasn't right. From that moment on, I realized I had to start paying attention to every detail. That Saturday, I woke up early to tidy the house. He was still sleeping soundly, as if nothing had happened the night before. I grabbed the shirt I'd left in the hamper and took it to the laundry room. As I folded the clothes, the strong scent of a strange perfume began to bother me again. It was impossible to ignore. As I vacuumed, I thought about how the small changes had accumulated over the past few months. Before, he'd enjoyed helping with chores. Now he barely cleared his plate. He said he was tired, but he still had the energy to show up late and excuse himself with meetings. His body was present, but his mind already seemed elsewhere. After lunch, he mentioned he needed to go out to take care of a few quick things. I just nodded, not questioning. He got in his car and left without looking me in the eye. I took advantage of the solitude to review old messages on my phone. I went over to the group of friends and reread the photo from the night before. Each time I enlarged the image, the mark on his neck became more evident. Mid-afternoon, I decided to go to the grocery store. While pushing my cart through the aisles, I received a message from a friend asking if everything was okay. She said she'd seen him going into a restaurant in another neighborhood a few days ago. I took a deep breath, replied that it must be a mistake, and changed the subject. But inside, the confirmation gnawed at me. I returned home and found his coat thrown on the couch. In the pocket was a parking receipt from a hotel we never used. The date was 3 days old. I tucked the paper away in my nightstand drawer, saying nothing. With each clue that emerged, I felt less pain and more determination. That night, he arrived in high spirits, like someone returning from a party. He said he'd run into coworkers and laughed at stories he didn't bother to elaborate on. I sat at the table and just listened. As he spoke, he constantly fiddled with his phone, locking the screen whenever I approached. This wasn't just carelessness, it was habit. During dinner, I told him that a friend had discovered her husband's infidelity through a simple notification on her smartwatch. He laughed, but it was nervous, short, almost awkward. He changed the subject too quickly, asking if I wanted to travel next month. It sounded like an attempt at distraction, not a real plan. After we went to the living room, he left his phone charging on the table. I went to the kitchen to get some water, and when I returned, saw the screen light up. It was a message from a ride-hailing app confirming a trip made at a time incompatible with what he'd told me. I didn't need to touch it. Just reading the preview was enough. I went to sleep before him, feigning exhaustion. Lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and thought about how life can suddenly change. Until a few weeks ago, I believed everything he said. Now, every word seemed rehearsed, and the more he believed his own lie, the more I became certain I was right. In the early morning, I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating. He was lying next to me, but he turned and responded quickly, thinking I wouldn't notice. Through the reflection in the wardrobe, I saw the glow of the screen and the slight smile on his face. That detail hurt more than any visible mark. In the morning, I made coffee in silence. He tried to chat about the weather, the news, but he seemed nervous. His tone was hurried, unnatural. By the time he grabbed his coat to leave, I already knew he wasn't exactly going to work. Intuition speaks softly, but speaks firmly. I spent the rest of the morning reviewing details. The strangely scented shirt, the hotel receipt, the group photo, the message from the running app. None of these pieces of evidence alone told the whole story, but together they formed a very clear story. And that story was far from the version he'd told me. At lunch, I sat alone at the table and stared at his empty seat. His absence was no longer physical, but emotional. I felt like I was sharing the house with a stranger, The worst part wasn't imagining what he was doing outside, but realizing that there was no sincerity inside. That afternoon, I went to visit my sister. We chatted about trivialities, but my mind was elsewhere. I even considered telling her, but held back. I didn't want advice. I wanted facts. And I knew that if I shared it too soon, I'd lose my chance to act calmly. Sometimes, silence is the greatest weapon. When I returned home, I found the garage empty. His car was gone. I waited a few hours, and around midnight, I heard the engine arrive. He came in smiling, bringing chocolates as a gift. He said he missed me and hugged me tightly. The gesture seemed rehearsed, not felt. I went to the room early while he showered. I grabbed the hotel receipt and the parking ticket and put them together in a folder. I was building my own dossier, piece by piece. It wasn't immediate revenge, it was strategy. I wanted there to be no doubt when the time came. As he slept, I lay awake staring at his face. The same face I'd known so many years ago, now so different. It wasn't the physical appearance that had changed, it was the expression. It was the look of someone living another hidden life. This detail, more than any proof, broke my heart. The next day, he left early, saying he had a meeting out of town. I gave him a quick kiss and smiled, as if I believed him. But deep down, I already knew that meeting wasn't happening. I closed the door and sat on the couch. My life was about to change, and I was no longer afraid. I grabbed my phone and reopened the hidden folder with the photos and receipts. I examined every detail and felt a strange power rise within me. It was no longer pain, it was clarity. I didn't need to ask anything. I didn't need to cry. The truth was already there, right in front of me. At that moment, I decided I wouldn't be caught off guard. I would wait calmly until he made the final mistake. And when that moment came, I would be ready. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't shouting the truth, but letting it reveal itself. And it was at that very moment that I realized what was about to happen would be even more devastating than any lipstick mark. I woke up early that Monday, even before my alarm clock went off. The silence in the house was heavy, only the ticking of the clock on the wall filled the space. I got up slowly and went straight to the laundry room. The shirt he'd worn on Friday was still there, waiting to be washed. The scent of the unfamiliar perfume lingered strongly, like an unwanted signature. As I made coffee, I remembered how attentive he used to be in these moments. Before, he'd offer to cut fruit, warm up bread, even make coffee when I was tired. Now, he'd come down late, talking on his cell phone, and not looking me in the eye. Small changes that said much more than words. He appeared in the kitchen with his jacket in hand and a forced smile. He sat at the table, took a quick sip of coffee, and said he had to leave early. I mentally noted the time, as I'd been doing. It was details like these that, when placed side by side, formed the timeline of the lie. After he left, I sat on the couch with my phone in hand. I opened the folder where I'd kept the evidence: the restaurant receipt, the photo of the mark on my neck, the hotel parking ticket. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a repeating pattern, growing ever clearer. And I knew there were still more signs to come. At work, I tried to stay focused. While my colleagues discussed reports and deadlines, my mind was elsewhere. I thought about how many women had been through this before and how many would still go through it. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, but the way he believed he could deceive me so easily. During my break, I picked up my phone to check social media. I saw that he'd liked old photos of a coworker, photos that were completely unrelated, but revealed a hidden interest. The detail went unnoticed by everyone but me. Each like was another piece of this puzzle. That afternoon, I received a call from him saying he'd be late at the office. The same old excuse, repeated so many times it had lost its naturalness. I responded calmly, pretending to believe him. But deep down, I registered the tone of his voice and the time of the call. I was no longer fooled by ready-made narratives. On the way home, I stopped at the pharmacy and bought a small folder. It would be my secret file, where I would store every physical piece of evidence. The clerk looked at me curiously, and I smiled as if it were just any folder. Little did he know that there I was beginning to organize the end of a years-long story. I arrived home to find the living room overly tidy, as if it had been prepared to look perfect. He was already there, with dinner almost ready. He said he wanted to surprise me, and indeed he did. Not with the gesture, but with the attempt to erase traces with romanticism. Flowers and dinners don't hide digital traces. As we ate, I told him about my day at work, observing his reactions. He listened little, responded in short sentences, and then quickly returned to his commitments. His gaze never left me, always wandering to his phone screen. He seemed more interested in what was going on outside the house than inside. After dinner, he went to take a shower. I grabbed his phone, which was charging, and looked at the lock screen. A notification that had been erased within seconds appeared and disappeared just as quickly. It was as if someone knew exactly the right moment to leave no trace. The detail gave me chills. I lay down on the bed and remained silent, feigning sleep. He lay down beside me and fiddled with his cell phone hidden under the covers. The slight smile on his face was impossible to hide. It was an intimate smile, no longer directed at me. This detail, more than any mark on his neck, was what hurt me the most. In the early morning, I heard my cell phone vibrate again. He got up slowly, thinking I was asleep, and went to the living room. I stood still, listening to his footsteps. My heart was pounding, but my body remained steady. I couldn't follow him yet. I had to wait. Patience was my ally. In the morning, he left early, saying he was having a business coffee. The scent of a different perfume lingered in the air after he closed the door. It was strong, intense, and unlike any of the perfumes we had at home. I took a deep breath and jotted down one more detail. With each passing day, the truth became impossible to hide. At work, once again, I couldn't concentrate. Between meetings, I picked up my phone and opened social media. I noticed it had stopped sharing its location with me. Before, it was something natural, unimportant. Now the lack of this feature spoke volumes more than any excuse. That afternoon, I went to the gym where he said he worked out every day. At the turnstile, I asked about his attendance. The attendant said she hadn't seen him in over a week. I smiled and thanked her, showing no surprise. But inside, it was as if I'd just found another piece that fit perfectly. I returned home with my mind full of thoughts. I sat on the couch and opened the folder where I kept the evidence. Now they weren't just papers. They were fragments of a parallel story he was trying to hide. I held each one tightly, as if it were my protection against deception. When he arrived that night, I noticed his effort to appear calm. He talked about work, commitments, meetings, but his expression didn't hold up to his words. I responded calmly, letting him believe I was still in control of the situation. Little did he know that I was already the one driving the story. Before going to sleep, I stared at the flowers still in the vase. They looked pretty, but they no longer held any meaning. They were just props in a poorly rehearsed play. Real life, the one I saw in its details, was far crueler than any performance. I closed my eyes, but didn't fall asleep right away. With each memory, each clue, the certainty grew stronger. I knew the definitive proof would soon come, the one that would leave no room for excuses. And when that happened, nothing would ever be the same. It was at that moment that I realized. The lie was about to reveal itself so clearly that even he could no longer deny it. That week, he started arriving later and later. He said they were urgent projects, that the company was demanding more of him. But I knew his routine well and knew it wasn't true. The gleam in his eyes wasn't of fatigue, it was of someone living a parallel life. His body was there, but his mind was gone. I decided not to say anything. I prepared dinner as usual, set the table, and left the TV on. When he came in, he feigned surprise. "Wow, you didn't even have to cook today." The thing was, he barely touched his food. He took 2 bites and then immediately said he wasn't hungry. If you eat dinner before you get home, you don't need to make excuses. The next day, I decided to observe every detail without saying anything. I noticed you'd changed your email password. Before, I'd used a shared one. Now everything was secure. The computer became inaccessible to me and my cell phone was never out of my pocket. It was as if he were locking the doors of a house that was still ours. On Thursday, he said he was having a business dinner. He put on a new shirt, sprayed on perfume, and hurried out. The detail that didn't go unnoticed was his exaggerated attention to his appearance. He never dressed up so much for regular meetings. I took the receipt I still had and placed it next to the new memory that was forming. I spent the night in silence, waiting. I turned on the TV, but I couldn't pay attention to anything. My head was spinning with possibilities. My heart was pounding, but my mind was growing stronger. I didn't just want proof. I wanted to understand what had happened to the man who had once sworn loyalty. When he returned, it was already past midnight. He walked in with his phone in hand, laughing at a message. He said he was exhausted and that it had been a long night. The thing is, the fatigue seemed fake. His body wasn't heavy, it was light, as if he'd enjoyed himself. This contrast needed no explanation. On Saturday, we went to the market together. While I was picking out fruit, he stepped away to answer his phone. I saw the smile on his face, his eyes shining. It was the kind of expression I hadn't seen in months at home. When he returned, he tried to hide it, but his face still carried that hidden happiness. At the checkout, he left his phone on the conveyor belt without realizing it. The screen lit up with a "See you tomorrow" message. It was a generic name, as if it were a coworker. But the format of the message left no doubt. It wasn't a work conversation, it was intimate. I picked up the bag and remained silent. At home, I put away the groceries and noticed he was more affectionate than usual. He hugged me from behind, complimented my hair, and talked about the future. This excessive attention wasn't natural. It was guilt overcompensating. When someone feels the need to reinforce the obvious, it's because they know they've already made a mistake. On Sunday, we had family lunch. My parents commented on how distant he seemed, checking his phone even during the meal. I covered it up, laughing, saying it was too much work. But deep down, that comment hit home. If even my family noticed, it wasn't just intuition. It was visible. That night, after everyone had left, I sat on the couch with him. I asked him how work was going, and he gave canned answers, devoid of detail. He repeated memorized phrases as if he were recording them. His gaze wouldn't hold the words, constantly shifting. It was like living next to a poorly rehearsed actor. Early Monday morning, I found a parking ticket in his wallet. Another hotel, another day that didn't match the official version. I tucked the ticket away with the others. My briefcase was no longer small. It was a collection of signs. Each piece formed a clear line that could no longer be ignored. When he arrived that night, he brought wine. He said it was to celebrate the coming week. He played music, trying to create a mood. I simply participated, without showing anything. The contrast between the gesture and the hidden evidence gave me a strange feeling. I smiled on the outside, but inside I was organizing the truth. In the early hours of the morning, I woke to the sound of my cell phone vibrating. He got up and went to the living room, as he had done before. I remained motionless, listening to his footsteps. The silence was broken only by the low sound of his voice, speaking in an intimate tone. With each word, the certainty grew more solid. The next day, I decided to stop waiting passively. I began to observe the details more methodically. Schedules, receipts, deleted messages, perfume on clothes. Everything written down, everything stored. I was no longer just a suspicious wife. I was an investigator in my own home. That afternoon, I received a message from a friend asking if I would attend his company event. I didn't know about any event. I asked him, and he said it wasn't important, that it would only be for a few guests. The thing is, the company always invited families. That was another poorly told lie. I went to the closet and found a new bag hidden in the back. Inside, an expensive shirt, still with the tag. He never bought clothes without showing me first. The thing was, it wasn't his size. It was smaller. That sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't just about going out. It was about giving someone a gift. That night, I pretended to go to sleep early. I heard him moving around the room, silently checking his phone. He whispered voice messages, trying not to wake anyone. Each muffled word was crueler than a scream. It was proof that there were no limits to his disguise. In the morning, when he left, I stood staring at the closed door. The emptiness of the house was heavy, as if it were hiding a secret. I looked at the wilted flowers, the still-scented clothes, the folder full of evidence. My life was no longer the same, and I knew it. I took a deep breath and sat down on the couch. The pain was there, but with it came strength. With each detail uncovered, his mask slipped a little further. And I knew that very soon, the next step would reveal everything without me having to say a word. And it was exactly at that moment that I understood. The truth would not come with a scandal. It would come in silence. And when it arrived, it would destroy everything at once. That morning, I woke up before him and decided to go for a walk around the neighborhood. I needed some fresh air. My head was so full. On the way, I ran into a neighbor who commented, "Your husband left early yesterday, didn't he?" I pretended not to know anything and just smiled. I kept the sentence as another piece in the puzzle. I returned home and made breakfast. He hurried downstairs, fiddling with his phone while he sipped his coffee, barely looking at me. I asked if he'd slept well, and he answered quickly, without looking up from the screen. He seemed to be in another world, far away. His body was there, but his mind clearly wasn't. While tidying the kitchen, I noticed he'd left his wallet on the table. I don't usually go through it, but something made me open it. Inside, I found a loyalty card from a restaurant we hadn't heard of. It was stamped with several recent visits. I memorized the detail without making a fuss. Later, I received a message from a coworker. She said she'd seen my husband driving past in a neighborhood far from ours. She said he seemed in a hurry and was alone. I thanked her for the information and covered it up. Each external report further reinforced what I already knew internally. During his lunch break, he called me to say he'd be at the office late. The excuse was a long meeting, but his voice was too light. It didn't sound like someone caught up in work. This contradiction struck me. Words can be deceiving, but tone of voice always tells the truth. I spent the rest of the afternoon in silence, organizing my things. I opened the drawer where I kept the folder with the evidence: the hotel receipt, the messages, the photo, the parking ticket, and now the loyalty card. Each item seemed small on its own, but together they formed a massive portrait. That night, he arrived with a bag of new clothes. He said he needed to update his wardrobe. I found this strange because he'd never cared so much about it. He opened the bag and revealed an elegant shirt, quite unlike his style. I smiled and said it looked nice, but inside I wondered who he was really dressing up for. During dinner, I brought up old travels, trying to spark memories. He responded vaguely, without emotion. Then he changed the subject to work. The contrast was painful. The memories that were once ours no longer had space, and the stories he told now sounded like poorly rehearsed scripts. After dinner, I noticed his cell phone was never out of his hand. He even took it with him to the bathroom. It was a recent habit. Before, he'd leave it anywhere, without a care. Now, the device seemed more valuable than anything. It wasn't hard to imagine why. On Saturday, I suggested we go out for lunch, but he declined. He said he already had plans with colleagues. I pretended to accept without question. I tidied the house and waited for the hour to pass. When I heard his car leave, I felt empty. It was like watching someone walk away on purpose without looking back. I decided to turn on the TV, but I couldn't pay attention to anything. I grabbed my phone and, almost without thinking, opened the banking app. I saw that he had made purchases at places we'd never frequented together. Small but frequent purchases. The pattern was clear: dinners, coffees, small gifts. That afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number. When I answered, the person hung up without saying anything. I found it strange, but I didn't think much of it. Later, I realized he'd also received a call at the same time, and the way he hid the screen only confirmed my suspicions. Silence sometimes speaks louder than words. That night, he returned more cheerful than usual. He said he'd met up with colleagues and that they were planning a new project. The smile was genuine, but not to me. It was the smile of someone who had just experienced something they didn't want to share. And that was what bothered me most. While he showered, I discreetly took the jacket he'd been wearing. In the pocket was a crumpled receipt for a parking lot. The parking lot was near an expensive restaurant in town. I put the paper in my briefcase, along with the others. My collection of evidence grew by the day. Sunday morning, he suggested we visit his in-laws. I spent the entire day observing how he interacted. He was more distracted, always on his phone. My in-laws commented that he seemed tired, but to me it wasn't fatigue. It was the weight of living 2 stories at once. Late that afternoon, we returned home. He turned on the TV and flopped down on the couch, as if nothing were wrong. I, sitting next to him, took in every detail of his face. He was no longer the same man I'd known. His gaze was different, full of secrets. And I already knew they wouldn't stay hidden for long. That night, before going to sleep, I noticed he'd left his phone charging face down. The gesture was automatic, but revealing. Those who have nothing to hide don't worry about it. The device became a barrier between us, and with each passing day, that barrier grew deeper. I lay in silence, listening to his heavy breathing. Outwardly, he seemed peaceful, but I knew otherwise. The sleep of those who hide is always light, as if they could wake at any noise. Mine, on the contrary, was growing heavier, full of thoughts and certainties. In the early hours of the morning, I got up and went to the living room. I sat on the couch and stared at the evidence I'd saved. Every day it grew, forming a weight that no longer rested on me. The question was no longer whether he was cheating. It was when I would use everything I'd saved. I took a deep breath and closed the folder. The silence in the house was broken only by the wind hitting the windows. I understood that lies have an expiration date, and his was nearing its end. I already had all the pieces in hand, and all that was left was to decide when to put them together. And it was at that very moment that I realized. His next mistake wouldn't just be a clue. It would be the definitive downfall of the entire charade. On Monday, he left home earlier than usual. He said he had a meeting out of town, but he didn't seem worried about traffic or schedules. He left wearing a new shirt, tidy hair, and strong perfume. I watched him through the window as the car disappeared around the corner. I filed that detail away like someone filing away evidence. After he left, I sat on the couch and opened my laptop. I decided to log into the shared credit card account. Over the past few days, there had been spending at restaurants we hadn't heard of. Small but frequent, almost daily amounts. It was as if he was trying to avoid attention, but he ended up leaving a perfect trail. Later, I went to the market and ran into a mutual friend. She mentioned that she'd seen him having lunch with someone during the week. She said it looked like a coworker, but the closeness was obvious. I smiled and hid it, but inside, that information felt like confirmation. People talk without realizing they're giving away secrets. I got home and organized the groceries. As I was putting away the bags, his phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up with the name of a generic contact, Project. The message simply said, "I arrived safely." I didn't touch it, just read it quickly before the screen went blank. People who name people like that don't want to be found out. That night when he returned, he brought pizza as a surprise. He said we should relax together. We sat on the couch watching TV, and he seemed perfectly relaxed. But every now and then his gaze would wander to his phone. His laughter didn't match the moment. It was as if his mind were elsewhere. In the middle of the night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. I went to the bedroom door and saw him in the living room, sitting on the couch with his cell phone in hand. The light illuminated his face and he smiled as he typed. I remained silent, just watching from the crack. That hurt more than any receipt I'd ever saved. The next morning, I had coffee ready before he came down. He arrived late, his tie already a little loose and in a hurry, like he didn't want to talk. I asked if everything was okay, and he replied with a quick, "Sure." His haste to get rid of questions was the best answer. I spent the day trying to maintain my routine. I worked, tidied the house, paid bills. But with each break, I returned to the folder where I kept the exam papers. The file grew like a silent diary. They weren't just objects, they were chapters in a parallel story he was unknowingly writing. That afternoon, I received a call on my cell phone. It was from an events company asking if I would RSVP to a dinner. The thing is, the invitation was in his name. I calmly asked, and the attendant said he had RSVP'd, but without a date. The anger I felt was mixed with clarity. That same day, he returned later than usual. He came home smiling, telling jokes as if he were feeling light. He put on music, opened wine, and tried to create a mood. It was as if the double life gave him energy instead of exhaustion. I just watched, recording every gesture. The contrast was impossible to hide. On Saturday, I suggested we go to the movies, but he declined, saying he had to work. I spent the afternoon at home rummaging through drawers. At the bottom of one, I found a folded piece of paper, a business card for an expensive restaurant. On the back, handwritten, "See you soon." I held the paper tightly. That night, he left, saying he was going to see friends. I offered to go with him, but he quickly declined. His discomfort was evident. I waited for him to leave and remained alone in the living room, staring at my phone, which was blinking on the table. This time, I didn't touch it. I just mentally noted the time and his reaction. When he returned, he was more cheerful than usual. His face was glowing, his perfume intense, his shirt wrinkled. He said the date had been great, but didn't elaborate. He asked us to go to bed early, as if to end any conversation. But his eyes told a different story. On Sunday morning, he got a call and went out to answer it in the backyard. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but I heard him say, "I miss you too." My body froze, but I maintained my composure. When he returned, he said it was work. I just smiled and nodded, holding on to one more certainty. I decided not to confront him, at least not yet. I knew the longer he believed I was being deceived, the more proof I'd have. And that gave me a strange sense of power. For the first time, I was in control. Not out of revenge, but because I knew exactly where I stood. During the week, I noticed he spent more time on his phone than with me. Even during dinner, his eyes were glued to the screen. I asked if it was work, and he replied irritably, "You're suspicious of everything." This aggressive reaction only reinforced what I already knew. Those who defend themselves without being attacked hide. On Wednesday, I decided to follow him discreetly. I waited for him to leave in his car and called an app to track him from afar. The route wasn't to work, but rather to a residential street. He parked, sat in the car for a few minutes, and then entered a building. My heart raced, but I remained cool. I walked home in silence, needing nothing more. It wasn't about exams anymore. It was about what would come next. The images kept swirling in my head. The smile on my phone, the perfume, the receipts, now the unfamiliar building. The story was complete, even without me seeing the ending. That night when he arrived, I sat on the couch and just stared at him. He asked why I was so serious, and I told him I was tired. There was no need for confrontation at that moment. Silence was my best strategy, because silence leaves room for the lie to reveal itself. I lay in bed with a heavy heart but a steady mind. The sound of his breathing bothered me more than ever. He slept peacefully, believing himself safe. Little did he know that the fall was already planned, and that it would be far more painful than he could have imagined. And it was at that moment that I understood. The first public crack was about to appear, and this time it would not be possible to disguise it. That week, he began to subtly change his habits. He'd always watch TV with me after dinner, but now he'd lock himself in his room, claiming to be tired. I'd be alone in the living room, listening to the muffled sound of my cell phone keypad coming from the hallway. The distance wasn't physical, it was emotional. One day, I decided to prepare a special dinner, something simple to break the routine. I bought the ingredients, set the table, and waited. But he called saying he'd already eaten with colleagues. The thing was, his voice was too light, with no sign of fatigue. People who really work late don't sound so cheerful. Over the weekend, I suggested we go for a walk in the park, like we used to. He declined, saying he needed to rest. I spent the morning alone, watching couples walk down the street from my window. The feeling of being in a lonely relationship was more painful than any lie. On Monday, a colleague called me to comment on a meeting he hadn't shown up for. I found it strange because he'd said he'd be out all day. I remained silent, listening to every detail. With each piece of information that arrived from outside, it became clearer that I wasn't imagining anything. That night, when he arrived, I noticed a different bag. He said he'd bought a gift for a friend but didn't want to show it. He tossed the bag in the closet and changed the subject. This kind of behavior had never happened before. The secret was in the form, more than the content. During dinner, I asked about work. He answered with vague, detail-free sentences. His gaze kept shifting as if he couldn't keep up with his own story. I smiled and let it pass, but inside I'd already registered every pause and every hidden lie. The next day, I woke up early and went to his car. In the back seat, there was a woman's scarf. A small detail, but impossible to ignore. I put it back where it was, as if I hadn't seen it. Sometimes, leaving the evidence where it is more effective than confronting it. That afternoon, I noticed he'd changed his laptop password. He'd never done that before. We always used it together. When I asked why, he said it was a system update. The justification sounded rehearsed, mechanical. This kind of barrier only appears when someone needs to hide something. At the market, I ran into an acquaintance who casually commented, "I saw your husband yesterday. He seemed in a real hurry." I asked where, and she said another neighborhood, far from what he'd told me. I thanked her with a smile, but inside I felt a chill seize my body. Another piece of the puzzle. That night, he brought dessert from a restaurant. He said a customer had offered it. But the packaging bore the same logo as one of the receipts I'd saved. I opened the dessert and ate it in silence, as if chewing on my own certainty. The taste was no longer sweet. On Saturday, I decided to tidy up his closet. At the back, I found a small, empty gift box. It was the perfect size for a piece of jewelry. I hadn't received anything in the last few months, so the question came automatically, who had it been for? I closed the box and put it back in the same place without moving anything. I spent the entire night thinking about it. Sleep wouldn't come, and every noise in the house seemed like a reminder. He slept soundly, but tossed and turned frequently, as if he couldn't relax even in sleep. Those who live a lie never truly rest. On Sunday, we went to my family's house for lunch. Everyone noticed how distant he was, always looking at his phone. When my mother mentioned it, he laughed and said it was work. But the exchange of glances across the table said it all. His distance wasn't just from me, it was from everyone. On the way home, the silence in the car was suffocating. I turned on the radio to hide it, but every song seemed to be about us. He didn't make conversation, he just drove. The emptiness in that small space was the best proof that there was no longer any dialogue. That night he left, saying he needed to see an old friend. I offered him a ride, but he quickly declined. I stayed home, watching the clock tick by. Every minute felt heavy. It wasn't jealousy, it was intuition. And intuition always knows when something isn't right. When he returned, he smelled of cigarettes and perfume mixed together. He'd never smoked, never could stand the smell of cigarettes. The detail needed no explanation. I simply turned over in bed and pretended to sleep. He lay down, turned to his side, and fell asleep within minutes. The weight of living a lie seemed to have lost its grip on him. On Monday, I went to work early and took the folder with the tests with me. I didn't show it to anyone, just kept it close. Just carrying it gave me strength. It was like I had a shield against his every word. That afternoon, I received another message from a friend. He was at a restaurant. He seemed in good spirits. The naturalness with which people talked about it surprised me. I didn't need to investigate. The truth came to me. And the more I got, the harder it was to keep silent. I returned home determined to keep my cool. I put dinner on the table, chatted about trivialities, and acted as if everything was normal. He believed me, and that was my greatest asset. The more confident he became, the more trails he left. I lay in bed that night certain that life was preparing me for something bigger. It wasn't just about the two of us anymore. The lies were spreading, leaving scars that would soon be seen by everyone. And once that happened, there would be no turning back. And it was in that moment that I realized his mask wouldn't just fall in front of me. It would fall in front of everyone, at the most unexpected moment. I woke up early on a Tuesday and went straight to making coffee. The silence in the house was broken only by the sound of the coffee maker. He came down in his usual hurry, but I could tell he was more cheerful than usual. His outfit wasn't typical for the office. It was more casual, almost too casual. As he ate hurriedly, his phone vibrated twice. He quickly picked it up, answered without looking at me, and put it in his pocket. I asked about his schedule for the day, and he waved me off. He simply said it would be a rush. I sipped my coffee in silence, taking in that extra detail. After he left, I started tidying the room. In the pocket of the pants he'd left on the floor, I found a folded napkin. It was written in pen. "See you Thursday, same time." The scent of perfume lingering on the fabric wasn't mine. I put the napkin in the folder, along with the other evidence. At work, I couldn't concentrate. I kept remembering his smile that morning, his haste, the different sparkle in his eyes. It was impossible not to notice. Anyone who's known him for years recognizes the change in even the simplest gestures. The problem wasn't suspicion anymore. It was living with certainty. At lunchtime, I decided not to go straight back to the office. I went to the restaurant I'd noted on one of my saved receipts. I walked in, sat at an inconspicuous table, and took a look around. I recognized the waiter from the receipt and asked if he remembered him. The young man said yes, that he always came, accompanied by a nice lady. The ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet, but I remained calm. I thanked them, ordered a coffee, and stood there for a few minutes, looking around. It was a nice place, but we'd never been together. The contrast between the surroundings and the pain I felt was almost unbearable. I got up and left in silence. That night when he arrived, he brought chocolates. He said he'd thought of me during the day. I smiled and thanked him, but inside the waiter's words echoed. The gesture felt like an attempt to erase his tracks. With each gift, I saw less love and more disguised guilt. The next day, he said he was traveling for work. He packed his small suitcase, took new shirts, and left early. I watched from the window until the car disappeared. I mentally noted the date and time. Deep down, I knew this trip was more about meetings than meetings. I spent the day calling around to keep my mind occupied, but nothing distracted me. In the afternoon, I went to visit my sister. We talked about simple things, but at one point she mentioned that I was a bit quiet. I just smiled and said I was tired. I didn't want to open up to anyone. I returned home alone. The silence was deafening. I opened the folder containing the proofs and stared at every detail. The collection was already considerable. Receipts, photos, notes, mementos. It was as if I'd put together a complete puzzle. All he needed was for him to realize I could see the whole picture. That night, I slept alone. The bed seemed larger, cold, empty. The space beside me, occupied for so many years, was now just a void full of secrets. I closed my eyes, but I couldn't rest. My mind whirled between fond memories and painful certainties. The next morning, he called me to say everything was fine. His voice was different, lighter, almost happy. I asked about the meeting, and he answered in short sentences. The thing is, I heard laughter in the background, female voices. I took a deep breath, thanked him for the call, and hung up. At work, I received an unexpected message. A college friend, unaware of anything, mentioned that she'd seen him at a cafe in another city. The photo she'd sent clearly showed him sitting at a table. In the background, a woman was playing with her hair and smiling at him. There was no doubt anymore. That night, he returned tired, saying the trip had been exhausting. He put his suitcase in the corner and lay down on the sofa. I stared at him, trying to find the man I'd known in his face. But he was gone. The look now was that of someone living another life, in another place. On Saturday, we went to a family dinner. He spent the night on his phone, laughing to himself at times. My parents commented that he seemed distant. I brushed it off, saying it was work stress. But inside, that comment stung. Even they could see through my hiding. On the way home, the car was silent. I turned on the radio, but no music filled the void. He seemed uncomfortable, checking his phone every now and then. When I asked if everything was okay, he quickly replied, "Of course. Why wouldn't I be?" Defensiveness always gives more away than silence. On Sunday, I woke up early and decided to clean the entire house. At the bottom of his backpack, I found a hotel receipt. It was from a simple hotel, but out of town. The date coincided with the meeting trip. I tucked the receipt into my briefcase as if it were the last missing piece. That afternoon, he arrived with flowers, saying he missed me. I smiled and put them in the vase, but it no longer had the same effect. Flowers don't erase evidence. Flowers don't disguise smells. They only decorate a lie. And lies, no matter how beautiful, always wither. As he spoke, I noticed a different expression on his face. His eyes shone strangely, as if he were somewhere else. The smile wasn't mine. It was borrowed from another story. I remained silent, simply observing. Sometimes there's no need to confront. Just watch. On Monday, he left in a hurry, leaving his phone charging. The screen lit up with a notification. It was wonderful yesterday. The contact was saved under a client name. I took a deep breath and didn't touch anything. I just smiled to myself, because there was no denying it anymore. I spent the day reflecting, not on what he did, but on how I would react. I discovered that the pain no longer paralyzed me. Now it gave me strength. The fear of facing the truth was replaced by the certainty that I wasn't wrong. This brought me calm. At night, I sat on the porch, gazing at the streetlights. The city seemed to be going on as normal, but inside me, everything was at war. I remembered when I believed that routine was synonymous with security. Today, I understood that even the everyday hides deep secrets. In the early hours of the morning, I woke to his phone vibrating. It was on the nightstand face down. The sound repeated several times. He was sleeping soundly, and I just watched. Each vibration was like confirmation, a reminder that there was nothing more hidden. At breakfast, I casually asked about the trip. He answered quickly, dropping names of people I didn't recognize. The sentences came ready-made as if he'd rehearsed them. I smiled and changed the subject. There was no point in questioning when I already had all the answers memorized. That afternoon, I reorganized the evidence folder. The physical weight of the material seemed to symbolize its emotional weight. Every page, every receipt, every detail was a piece that confirmed my intuition. And intuition never failed. The truth was there, printed on small pieces of paper. When he arrived, I noticed the nervousness in his eyes. He avoided looking at me, spoke quickly, and changed the subject. It was like watching someone stumble over their own words. The theater was no longer fun. I knew the curtain would fall at any moment. On Saturday, we were invited to a birthday party. During the party, I noticed him wandering off several times to check his phone. A friend commented, "Your husband's acting different, isn't he?" I smiled and changed the subject, but that observation showed that the charade was already beginning to leak out of the house. That night, at home, I sat on the couch and stared at him. He was fiddling with his phone, chuckling to himself, while I remained silent. That simple scene spoke volumes. Sometimes betrayal doesn't need to be caught red-handed. It reveals itself in routine, in small gestures. When we lay down, I rolled over and closed my eyes. The weight of what I knew was heavy, but it no longer destroyed me. On the contrary, it strengthened me. He slept peacefully, believing the disguise. I, awake, knew the next step was inevitable. And it was at that moment that I understood. The lie was about to get out of his control, and when that happened, there would be no going back. That Monday, he forgot to bring his coat to work. Since it was cold, I considered letting him know, but decided against it. Later, when he got home, he was carrying another coat that wasn't his. He said he'd borrowed it from a coworker. I kept the scene to myself without commenting. At breakfast the next day, I realized he avoided looking me in the eye. He talked while looking at his cup, at his phone, anywhere. His silence spoke louder than any sentence. I just watched, trying not to show the mixture of anger and calm that consumed me. During the afternoon, rummaging through a drawer in the living room, I found 2 movie tickets. The showing was for a film I'd talked about months ago, but we'd never seen together. They were worn, bearing the date from the previous week. I kept the tickets like one would a scar. That night he brought a different wine. He said a customer had given it to me as a gift. I recognized the label. It was the same one from the restaurant where it often appeared on receipts. I smiled, thanked him, and poured the glasses. We toasted, but inside I had a bitter taste. I knew where it came from. On Wednesday, I decided to test his reaction. I casually asked if he'd like to go to the movies with me this weekend. He quickly declined, saying he didn't like the atmosphere. The contradiction was glaring. He'd just used the tickets, but he steadfastly refused. That detail convinced me. At work, I received a message from a friend. "Your husband is nearby." I saw him going into a coffee shop. I glanced at my watch. It was the same time he said he was in a meeting. I took a deep breath, thanked him for the message, and moved on with my day. There was no longer any room for doubt. That evening, he arrived tired and complaining about a difficult meeting. With every word, I remembered my friend's message. I observed the way he gestured, the intonation of his voice, the excess of invented details. The more he talked, the clearer it became that the act was no longer sustainable. On Thursday, I found a paper bag in the trunk of my car. Inside was an empty jewelry box. The label was still attached. I hadn't received any gifts that week. I closed the bag and put it back, as if nothing had happened. Sometimes feigning blindness is more strategic. During dinner, I asked him how his day had been. He answered quickly, without enthusiasm. He avoided open-ended questions, preferring short sentences. I pretended to believe him, but I mentally noted every detail. His mind seemed occupied with sustaining the lie, not living the truth. On Friday, I left work early and walked past the restaurant I'd been to before. I saw his car parked there. I didn't go in, just watched from afar. My heart raced, but there was no need to catch him. The confirmation no longer destroyed me. It only strengthened me. I returned home and set the dinner table. When he arrived, he acted normal, as if he'd just left the office. I served the food in silence, listening to his memorized apologies. The contrast between the scene I'd seen and his words was almost cruel. On Saturday morning, I went to the market alone. While picking out fruit, I ran into an old friend. She mentioned she'd seen him recently with someone else, but didn't want to go into details. I smiled, thanked her, and changed the subject. The truth no longer needed to be spoken out loud. It was everywhere. That afternoon, while tidying up the laundry, I found the scent of a strong perfume on his clothes. It wasn't mine, nor anyone else's in the family. It was intense, striking, impossible to ignore. I washed the garment, but the scent still lingered in my memory. Perfumes are invisible traces that are not easily erased. That night, he brought a dessert, saying it was for both of us. I smiled, but thought about how many times that same dessert had been shared with someone else. The sweet treat on the plate no longer tasted good. It was just a reminder that his routine was no longer with me. On Sunday, we were invited to a family lunch. During the meal, he seemed distant, constantly checking his phone. My sister noticed and looked at me suspiciously. I pretended not to notice. I didn't want to open a wound that still needed to be healed. On Monday, I woke up and decided to review my exam papers. The folder was full, barely holding any more papers. Every receipt, every note, every detail formed a continuous line. They were no longer loose fragments. Now they were a whole story told in traces. That afternoon, he called me from his car. He said he was stuck in traffic. As he spoke, I heard laughter in the background. It wasn't the radio, it wasn't street noise. It was someone talking to him. I pretended to believe him and hung up. The silence after the call was more revealing than any physical evidence. That night, when he arrived, I asked if the traffic was bad. He confirmed it, even detailing streets he hadn't even passed. The lie was rehearsed, but his intonation betrayed it. His body spoke another language. His discomfort was palpable. Another scene etched in my memory. On Tuesday, I found a small bag hidden in my closet. Inside, a used lipstick. It had never been mine, it wasn't my color. The detail was simple yet devastating. I closed the bag and put it in my briefcase. It was as if every week brought a new piece. That afternoon, I received an email advertising a hotel. I opened it by chance and recognized the name. It was the same as the one on the receipt I already had. Fate seemed determined to rub the truth in my eyes. I deleted the email but mentally retained the weight of that coincidence. That night, he tried to kiss me tenderly. I felt the gesture cold, mechanical, emotionless. His body was there, but his soul was already elsewhere. I closed my eyes and allowed it, not out of love, but out of strategy, letting him believe it was the best weapon I had. On Wednesday, I decided to observe more than act. I spent the day recording schedules, calls, and messages. It was like creating a parallel diary, different from the one he told me. Numbers don't lie. His routine didn't match the stories he repeated. That afternoon, he arrived with flowers. He said he'd thought of me in the middle of the day. I put them in the vase, thanked him, and smiled. But inside me, the scene no longer held any power. Flowers don't erase digital traces. They don't hide receipts. They don't mask smells. They're just temporary distractions. In the early hours of the morning, I woke again to my phone vibrating. He got up slowly, as usual, and walked into the living room. The low sound of his laughter carried down the hallway. It was cruel to realize that the laughter that had once been mine now belonged to someone else. The next morning, I made coffee in silence. He sat down and talked about his day, but his voice was unsteady. With each sentence, I could hear the effort he was making to maintain control. I smiled, letting him believe it. Deep down, I was no longer trapped in the pain, but in the preparation. That afternoon, I found a photo of him on a colleague's social media account. He was smiling in a bar. At the same time, he claimed to be in a meeting. The detail was obvious. The wine glass next to him had a lipstick mark. I saved the photo without hesitation. That night, I sat on the couch and watched him. He talked about work, made plans, but all I could think about was the photo. It was impossible not to see the contradiction between words and images. The theater was about to end, and I was in the front row. On Friday, I woke up with a strange feeling. I knew something big was about to happen. The lie was no longer confined to small details. It was beginning to leak out, gaining witnesses, leaving public trails. It was only a matter of time before it exploded. I lay in bed that night with my heart racing, my body tired but my mind alert. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. My whole life seemed to be preparing for that inevitable moment. And when it arrived, nothing would ever be the same again. And it was at that very moment that I realized his next move would destroy not only the two of us, but the image he maintained in front of everyone. The first change happened silently. I no longer woke up waiting for his message. The cell phone on the table no longer caused anxiety. Absence stopped being painful and became a habit. It's strange how we get used to emptiness. And deep down, we realize that emptiness can be light. I began to fill my time with simple things. Morning walks, coffee sipped slowly, music playing softly in the kitchen. I realized there's life in the details, in the small gestures. While he was wrapped up in his own lie, I was relearning how to breathe. And each breath felt like a new step. One day, while opening my closet, I noticed how many of my clothes were stored away, forgotten. I decided to wear them, even without any particular reason. I put on an old dress, put on lipstick, and looked at myself in the mirror. It wasn't vanity, it was rediscovery. I recognized a version of myself that had disappeared. His calls continued. His tone of voice varied between pleading and apologetic. I listened silently and then hung up, not out of coldness, but out of clarity. The time for believing was over. Silence was my answer, and also my victory. On social media, comments about him began to surface. Friends noticed changes, coworkers questioned his absence. The charade was unraveling itself. And I didn't have to do anything. Sometimes life exposes what we don't need to shout about. One afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee. I looked at the street, at the people passing by, and thought, I'm here, I'm still going. It was simple, yet powerful. The world moved on, and so did I. It wasn't the end of anything, it was the beginning of something else. A friend asked me out. I accepted. We laughed and talked, as if time had turned back. I discovered I could still truly smile. And best of all, without having to hide pain behind laughter. My body felt light, like someone lifting a weight off my shoulders. I returned home late, my soul at peace. He sent messages saying he was sorry. I read them but didn't respond. For the first time, I didn't feel anger, just indifference. The opposite of love isn't hate. It's not needing to feel anything else. At work, colleagues complimented me without realizing it. They said my appearance was different, more confident. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The glow returned little by little, without explanation. Life was already beginning to give me back what I thought I'd lost. On Saturday, I organized the house. I threw out old objects, cleaned out drawers, and made space. Each trash bag seemed to symbolize something I was leaving behind. It was more than just cleaning. It was a ritual. Getting rid of what was no longer useful. I found the folder with the evidence. I opened it slowly, like someone leafing through an old book. I felt no pain, no anger. I felt pride. Proud of having endured, of having seen, of not having lost myself. Each receipt was a reminder of how much I endured. I grabbed the folder, went to the fireplace, and let the flames do the rest. The fire consumed slowly, leaf by leaf. I watched the lies turn to ash, weightless. I closed my eyes and let the warmth touch my face. It was the goodbye I needed. On Sunday, I went to visit my parents. My mother held my hand and said, "You seem stronger." I smiled. She didn't know the details, but she felt the change. The strength didn't come from defeating someone, but from not letting myself fall. No one can take that away from me. Little by little, his messages diminished. Silence filled the space where once there had been cries of apology. It was the natural end of something that would never return. Life always finds a way to silence what doesn't deserve space. I started writing again. Short texts, loose thoughts. I discovered that putting them on paper helped clear my mind. I wasn't writing about him, I was writing about myself. About freedom, about starting over, about learning to be whole again. One day, walking through the neighborhood, I realized I hadn't thought about him in hours. It was a shock, but a good one. The weight lifted without me even noticing. Freedom doesn't arrive suddenly. It creeps in, slowly, until you realize it no longer hurts. That night, I opened a bottle of wine and poured it for myself. I put on some music and danced alone in the living room. It wasn't solitude, it was celebration. I celebrated being alive, being strong, being on my feet. And that was worth more than any company. Little by little, I noticed that people began to look at me differently. Friends viewed me with admiration, colleagues with respect. Not because they knew the story, but because they felt the energy. Those who rebuild themselves shine in a way no one can ignore. The memories still came back, but they no longer hurt. It was like watching an old movie. I knew the story, but it no longer affected me. The past was in its place, and I was in mine. And that place was peaceful. One day, I saw him on the street, from afar. He was dejected, lacking the spark I once knew. He saw me too, but didn't come closer. He just looked away. In that moment, I understood. I wasn't the one who lost. The ones who lose are always those who live a lie. I kept walking, head held high. The wind in my face seemed to push me forward. I felt proud, not of having discovered something, but of having chosen not to keep quiet about it. The intuition that had once alerted me now guided me toward something new. That night, I wrote on a piece of paper, "I am enough." I folded it and put it inside a book. It was my reminder. Every time I doubted myself, I would have that phrase. Because in the end, the greatest discovery wasn't about him, it was about me. The following days were light. I laughed more, slept better, and ate without feeling heavy. The simplest things, like watching the sunset, took on a new meaning. It wasn't about what I'd lost anymore. It was about what I'd regained. My life. I decided to travel alone. I took a bus to a nearby city just for a change of scenery. I walked unfamiliar streets, sat in cafes, and people watched. I discovered that freedom also tastes like adventure, and it was a taste I wouldn't trade for anything. Back home, I looked in the mirror again. This time I didn't look for anything, I just recognized myself. I smiled at myself and thought, you won. Not because you exposed yourself, not because you took revenge, but because you chose to be free. And that's when I understood. When the lie falls, it's not the end of the world. It's the beginning of another. And this time, a world I control. Because being free is never a loss. It's always a victory.